Sheriff, FBI, step away from the desk. Hands where I can see him now.
Please, there is a mistake.
Once is a mistake, twice is suspicious. Marshand Crisler did this 3 times in his first 3 months as Sheriff of Hinds County, and left a federal paper trail for every single one.
Soliciting and accepting $9,500 in bribes, supplying ammunition to a convicted felon.
I have run this department straight every single day, please.
3 cash payments across.
$9,500. 3 cash payments. 3 months. That was all it took for the newly appointed Sheriff of Hinds County, Mississippi, to put his badge on the auction block. By the time the FBI Jackson field office finished cataloging the evidence, the man on this footage would be facing 2 federal counts, a 10-year maximum on each, and a sentencing date he could already see on his calendar. The bribe started in his first 90 days on the job. The convicted felon paying them got investigation intel, a relocated family member, and the promise of a sheriff's office paycheck. Chrysler got the cash and the indictment that ended his career. Before we go any further, what would you do if you found out the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in your county was quietly on the payroll of a convicted felon? Drop your honest reaction below, and if you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. This channel doesn't let stories like this get buried, and the next case on the queue is even harder to look away from. Marshand Crisler was born in Jackson, Mississippi in 1969, the son of a postal clerk and a public school teacher who lived on a quiet residential street just west of the Pearl River. His childhood unfolded in the long shadow of the civil rights era. Jackson was still healing from the violence of the 1960s, and the city's politics, its churches, and its police department were all in the middle of a generation-long transformation. His parents told him from the beginning that the way out and the way up ran through education, work, and the uniform. 2 of his uncles had served in the Army. A third had spent 22 years driving a city bus. Service in the Chrysler house was not optional. He graduated from Provine High School in 1987, played defensive line on a football team that never made it past the second round of the state playoffs, and signed up for the Army Reserve the summer before he turned 18. The recruiter promised him discipline, a paycheck, and the kind of resume that would open doors in Mississippi. All 3 turned out to be true. He spent 6 years in uniform, drilled at Camp Shelby on the weekends he wasn't pulling shifts as a security guard at a grocery store on Highway 80, and finished his enlistment as a corporal with a clean record and a folder full of commendations. In 1995, he applied to the Jackson Police Department. The application photograph that still sits in his personnel file shows a young man in his mid-20s with a close-cropped fade, a thin mustache, and the kind of upright posture that comes from 6 years of being told to stand up straight. His background investigator wrote that Chrysler was respectful, articulate, and clearly motivated by a desire to serve the community he grew up in. His written exam score landed in the top 10%. His physical fitness test was unremarkable. His polygraph came back clean. The academy class he joined that fall was the largest Jackson PD had recruited in 5 years, and his instructors graded him as consistently above average with a particular aptitude for report writing and de-escalation. His first patrol assignment was Precinct 3, on Jackson's west side, the same neighborhoods he had grown up in, the same gas stations and corner stores and basketball courts. His training officer was a 15-year veteran named Sergeant Eugene Pittman, who told the rest of the shift that Chrysler was the kind of rookie you don't have to explain things to twice. Pittman would later tell the trial jury that he had recommended Chrysler for plainclothes work within his first 18 months on the job, an unusually fast track in a department that typically made officers wait 3 to 5 years before considering the move. Chrysler made detective in 2001. His division was property crimes, then narcotics, then a brief rotation through the homicide unit before a department reorganization moved him back to plainclothes street enforcement. By 2007, he was a sergeant. By 2012, he was a lieutenant. His evaluations during this period describe him in the language Jackson PD reserved for officers it intended to promote. Demonstrates initiative, effective communicator, shows strong leadership potential at the supervisory level. Officers under his command described him as fair, available, and unusually patient with rookies. Officers above him in the chain described him as a man being groomed for the upper command staff. He retired from Jackson PD in 2015 with 20 years of service, a chest full of departmental ribbons, and a city pension that paid out roughly $4,100 a month. Most retired Jackson PD officers in his position took a security director job at a hospital or a casino. Chrysler ran for office instead. In 2017, he won a seat on the Jackson City Council representing Ward 6, a district that included some of the city's most economically distressed neighborhoods and one of its busiest commercial corridors. His campaign literature emphasized public safety. 20 years on the streets of this city, and I'm not done yet. His vote totals beat the incumbent by a margin of nearly 3-1. On the council, he sat on the Public Safety Committee, the Planning Committee, and a special subcommittee on intergovernmental coordination with Hinds County. He was, by every visible measure, exactly what Mississippi politics tells young black men they can become if they keep their head down and put in the work. Then, in the summer of 2021, the long-serving Sheriff of Hinds County resigned. The Hinds County Board of Supervisors had 30 days under state law to appoint a replacement to serve out the unexpired term. They interviewed 9 candidates. They narrowed the list to 3. On August 24, 2021, by a 4-1 vote, they appointed Marshand Crisler, former Jackson PD lieutenant, current Ward 6 city councilman, 26 years of Mississippi law enforcement experience, to fill the vacancy. He was sworn in the following morning in a brief ceremony at the Hinds County Courthouse in Raymond. His wife, Andrea, held the Bible. His daughter, then a sophomore at Tougaloo College, recorded the moment on her phone from the second row. He was 52 years old. He had spent his entire adult life in uniform, and he had just been handed the badge for the largest sheriff's office in the state of Mississippi. Within 90 days, he would be soliciting his first bribe. Hinds County is Mississippi's most populous county, home to roughly 230,000 residents, the state capital in Jackson, the bulk of the Jackson metropolitan area, and the Delta's Gateway Corridor north along Interstate 55. The sheriff's office, headquartered in the small town of Raymond about 15 miles southwest of Jackson, employs more than 400 sworn deputies, civilian staff, and detention officers. It operates a county jail with a rated capacity of about 650 inmates, a courthouse security detail, a civil process division, and a criminal investigations bureau that works alongside the FBI, the DEA, and the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation on cases that cross jurisdictional lines. The sheriff in Mississippi is one of the most powerful elected officials in any county. He controls the jail. He controls the deputies. He controls who gets hired, who gets fired, who gets promoted, and which investigations get resources. He sits on multiple multi-agency task forces. He has access, by virtue of his office, to active investigation files, confidential informant records, narcotics intelligence reports, and the daily movement logs of every inmate housed in his facility. In a county the size of Hinds, the sheriff knows what the FBI is doing before the FBI tells anyone else. He knows which dealers are under surveillance. He knows which inmates are cooperating. He knows which deputies are clean and which ones are not. That access is the foundation of public trust. It is also, in the wrong hands, a menu of things to sell. The jail itself sits behind the courthouse in Raymond, a 2-story concrete and steel facility that houses pretrial detainees from across the county. Inmates are sorted by classification at intake: violent versus nonviolent, gang-affiliated versus unaffiliated, cooperating witness versus general population. The classification determines housing. Housing determines safety. A man with the wrong enemies on the wrong tier can be dead within 48 hours. The sheriff's office has standard protocols for protective custody requests, and those protocols can be invoked by the inmate, by the inmate's attorney, by the jail's medical staff, or, and this is the part that mattered, by the sheriff himself, with a single phone call to the booking sergeant. Investigation intelligence flows the same way. Active case files are stored on a secure server with limited access. Deputies working narcotics cases brief their supervisors weekly. Supervisors brief the chief deputy. The chief deputy briefs the sheriff. The sheriff knows everything. There is no internal firewall between the elected official at the top and the confidential information moving up the chain. The system depends entirely on the integrity of the man at the top. Hiring works the same way. The sheriff has final say on every new deputy, every civilian employee, every detention officer. Background investigations are conducted, polygraphs are administered, training certifications are verified. But the sheriff can override any flag, expedite any application, or quietly add a name to the next academy class. The paperwork follows the decision follows the sheriff. The trust framework, in other words, is total. Citizens of Hinds County hand the sheriff the keys to the investigations that protect them, the jail that holds the people accused of crimes against them, and the paychecks of the deputies who patrol their streets. They do this on the explicit assumption that the man holding those keys is not for sale. Marshand Crisler had been sheriff for less than a month when he discovered that someone wanted to buy. The convicted felon at the center of this case is identified in the federal indictment only by initials. Court filings would later describe him as a man in his early 40s with 2 prior felony convictions, one for drug distribution in 2009, one for being a felon in possession of a firearm in 2015, and a working knowledge of how the Hinds County criminal justice system actually operated from the inside. He had spent time in the county jail. He had family currently in the county jail. He had drug trade associates currently being investigated by Hinds County detectives. He also had cash. The indictment refers to him throughout simply as Individual A. Individual A had grown up in the same West Jackson neighborhoods that Chrysler had patrolled in his first decade with JPD. They had not been friends. They had not been close. But they were the kind of acquaintances that exist between a long-tenured street cop and a long-tenured street offender in a mid-sized southern city. They recognized each other. They had spoken in passing at funerals, at gas stations, at the courthouse. When Chrysler was appointed sheriff in August 2021, Individual A read the headline in the Clarion Ledger and saw an opportunity. The first contact came in early September. According to evidence introduced at trial, Individual A reached out to Chrysler through a mutual associate, a Jackson barbershop owner who had known both men for years, and requested a private meeting. The meeting took place at a restaurant on County Line Road in the early evening, away from the sheriff's official vehicle and away from the sheriff's official phone. They sat in a back booth. Individual A laid out his asks. He had a brother in the Hinds County Jail awaiting trial on an aggravated assault charge, and the brother was housed on a tier where he had enemies. He needed the brother moved. He also wanted information, quiet, ongoing information, about whether his own name was coming up in any active narcotics investigations within the sheriff's office. And he wanted eventually a job, a real job, a sheriff's office paycheck, the kind that came with a uniform and a badge and the legal authority to walk into any room in Hinds County without being questioned. Chrysler did not say no. What he said, according to recorded conversations introduced at trial, was that they could work something out. The number, $3,500 in cash, as a first show of good faith, came up before the appetizers arrived. By the end of the meal, the arrangement was in motion. The first payment was delivered 11 days later, in the parking lot of a gas station on Highway 18, just inside the Hinds County line. Individual A handed Chrysler a brown paper bag containing $3,500 in 50s and 100s. Within 72 hours, the brother in the Hinds County Jail was moved from his original tier to a protective custody pod on the second floor, a move that, on paper, was authorized by a verbal directive from the sheriff's office and required no written justification beyond that single notation in the jail's classification log. No incident had triggered the move. No medical request had been filed. No grievance had been submitted. The brother went to bed in one cell block and woke up in another. The second payment came in October, $3,000, again in cash, again in a parking lot, this one behind a strip mall in Northeast Jackson after dark. In exchange, Chrysler provided individual A with information about a pending narcotics investigation that was, according to internal sheriff's office records, in the active surveillance phase. The case involved a mid-level cocaine distribution network operating out of the Medgar Evers Boulevard corridor. Individual A's name was not in the case file, but several of his associates were. Chrysler told him which names were under surveillance, which addresses were being watched, and approximately how long the investigation had been running. He did not give him paperwork. He gave him enough to make decisions. Within 10 days of that conversation, 2 of the surveillance targets, both of whom had been under court-authorized wiretap for nearly 4 months, abruptly changed phones, changed vehicles, and moved their operation to a different part of the city. The wiretap went dark. The investigation, which had been weeks away from indictments, collapsed and had to be rebuilt from scratch. Detectives in the narcotics unit were furious. They believed they had a leak. They did not yet know it came from the top of their own chain of command. The third payment came in November, $3,000 in cash, handed off this time in the front seat of individual A's vehicle in a parking lot off Ellis Avenue. The conversation that day, captured on a recording device that individual A did not know was in the vehicle, included the explicit promise that Chrysler would make sure individual A's application to the Hinds County Sheriff's Office was processed favorably. A felony conviction was a disqualifier. 2 felony convictions made the application a non-starter under any honest reading of the department's hiring standards. Chrysler said in his own words that he would find a way around it. He talked about background investigators he trusted to look the other way. He talked about expungement attorneys in Jackson who could clean things up on paper. He talked, in that recording, like a man who had done this before. He had not. That was the problem. He had been sheriff for 91 days, and he had already sold information, sold housing, and sold the prospect of employment, all to the same man, all for the same $9,500 in cash. The arrangement was sloppy. The communications were not encrypted. The cash handoffs happened in public parking lots. There was no tradecraft. There was no operational security. There was no awareness that the man across the booth from him had been wearing a recording device since the first meeting. Because individual A, somewhere between September and the gas station handoff, had stopped working alone. The FBI Jackson Field Office, located on Hospital Drive on the north side of the city, runs one of the most active public corruption squads in the southeastern United States. Mississippi is, by federal corruption conviction per capita measures, consistently one of the top 5 states in the country. The Jackson office has a long institutional memory of sheriff cases, mayor cases, supervisor cases, and police chief cases. They know the rhythms, they know the warning signs, and they know, most importantly, how to develop and run cooperating sources inside small county political networks where everyone knows everyone. The investigation that brought down Marshand Crisler did not start with Chrysler. It started with individual A. In the summer of 2021, before Chrysler was even appointed sheriff, federal agents had been quietly building a case against individual A on narcotics distribution charges. They had a wiretap. They had financial records. They had cooperating witnesses. They had enough, by the end of August, to indict him on a federal trafficking count that carried a 15-year mandatory minimum and the realistic possibility of a sentence north of 20. In early September, an FBI agent and an assistant U.S. attorney sat down with individual A in a conference room at the federal building on East Capitol Street and laid out his choices. He could go to trial and lose. He could plead and serve 20 years. Or he could cooperate. Individual A chose cooperate. What the FBI did not yet know, what they would not learn until the conversation continued, was that individual A had a sheriff he was already planning to approach. The new sheriff. The one who had been sworn in 3 weeks earlier. The one who had grown up in his neighborhood. The one who, in individual A's read of the situation, might be persuadable. The FBI listened. The FBI asked questions. By the end of the meeting, individual A had a new role. He would approach Chrysler exactly as he had originally intended, but with a recording device in his pocket, a controlled-buy cash bundle in his hand, and an FBI surveillance team 3 vehicles back at every meeting. The first meeting at the County Line Road restaurant, the meeting where the asks were laid out and the $3,500 number was first spoken, was, from the FBI's perspective, a baseline. They wanted to see whether Chrysler would say no. They wanted to see whether he would pause or hesitate or pull individual A aside and tell him this was not a conversation they could have. They wanted to see, in other words, whether the Sheriff of Hinds County was the kind of man who would walk out of that booth and call the FBI himself. He did not. He sat through the conversation. He named the price. He agreed to the asks. He shook the hand of a man he had every professional reason to know was a convicted felon, a known narcotics distributor, and a person of interest in ongoing investigations within his own department. And then, 11 days later, in the parking lot of a gas station on Highway 18, with FBI agents photographing the exchange from a surveillance van across the lot, he accepted the first payment. Every meeting after that, every phone call, every parking lot handoff, every restaurant conversation was recorded. The FBI had audio, they had video, they had GPS tracking on individual A's vehicle, they had cash that had been photographed, serial number recorded, and bundled by FBI evidence technicians before each handoff. They had, in short, the entire operation in real time from the inside. The decision to also document the ammunition transfer came later, but it would prove to be the cleanest charge in the case. Individual A told his handlers that Chrysler had, on one occasion, given him a box of ammunition, a small thing, almost incidental, knowing full well that Individual A was a convicted felon, legally prohibited from possessing it. The FBI asked him to ask for more. They wanted the transfer on tape. They wanted Chrysler to physically hand it over while a recording device was running. He did. The serial-numbered evidence bag containing that ammunition, with Chrysler's fingerprints recovered from the cardboard packaging, would become Exhibit 14 at trial. By the time the third bribe payment was made in November, the FBI Jackson Field office had a complete federal case. They had the audio, they had the video, they had the marked currency, they had the firearms transfer. They had a defendant who, in his own recorded words, had described how he intended to circumvent the hiring standards of his own department to put a convicted felon in a sheriff's office uniform. What they did not have yet was their preferred indictment date. The U.S. Attorney's Office wanted to let the case develop. They wanted to see who else came into the orbit. They wanted to see whether other deputies, other officials, other associates of Chrysler's might surface. The investigation continued, quietly, internally, without a single leak to the press, for the better part of the next 2 years. We're heading into the trial now. If you want to know exactly how the federal system handles a sitting sheriff caught on tape, subscribe and stay through to the end. We break down every detail the local news skipped. The federal grand jury sitting in the Southern District of Mississippi began hearing testimony in the Chrysler matter in the early summer of 2023. By that point, the FBI's evidence room contained more than 90 hours of recorded conversations, thousands of pages of financial records, dozens of physical exhibits, and corroborating testimony from at least 4 cooperating witnesses inside and adjacent to Hinds County Sheriff's Office operations. The recordings were the centerpiece. In one, captured in October 2021, Chrysler can be heard explaining to Individual A how the jail's classification system actually worked, which deputies could be relied on to process a tier transfer without asking questions, which shifts were the easiest to move someone through, and which booking sergeants would simply sign whatever paperwork was placed in front of them. In another, captured in November, he discussed the active narcotics investigation in the Medgar-Evers corridor, with enough specificity that federal prosecutors would later describe his statements as operationally damaging to a federally coordinated narcotics investigation. In a third, he can be heard counting bills in the front seat of Individual A's vehicle. Chrysler, recording transcript. That's 3,000. We said 3 even, right? Individual A, 3 even. Chrysler. All right, we're good. Individual A. And the application, you still good on that? Chrysler. I told you I'd handle it. I'll handle it. The financial records told their own story. In the 3 months covering the bribe payments, Chrysler made a series of unusual cash deposits into a personal checking account at a credit union in Jackson. 5 deposits in total, ranging from $400 to $1,200 each, all conducted at branches he did not normally use, all conducted on dates that corresponded within 72 hours to each of the 3 bribe handoffs. He also made cash purchases that he had not previously made. A payment toward an outstanding credit card balance. A partial down payment on a used SUV for his daughter. A series of cash withdrawals reversed within days, as if the money were being moved to test for surveillance. Each individual transaction was small. Together, they painted a pattern that any financial crimes investigator would recognize immediately. The cooperating witnesses inside the sheriff's office filled in the rest. A booking sergeant at the Hinds County Jail confirmed that the tier transfer for Individual A's brother had been ordered verbally, with no incident report, no medical justification, and no written request. A civilian human resources employee in the Sheriff's Office Hiring Division confirmed that Chrysler had personally pulled Individual A's application out of the standard review queue and asked, in her exact recollected words, what they could do about the background. A detective in the narcotics unit confirmed that the Medgar Evers investigation had collapsed in October 2021 in a manner that veteran investigators believed could only be explained by an internal leak. The smoking gun, in the end, was not any single recording or any single witness. The smoking gun was the sequence: 3 cash payments, 3 months, 3 categories of corrupt favors, 1 ammunition transfer to a known convicted felon, all of it documented, all of it time-stamped, all of it tied together by the federal recording devices that Individual A had been carrying since the very first meeting at the County Line Road restaurant. By the time the grand jury voted to indict in early 2024, the case against Marshand Crisler was, in the assessment of the lead assistant U.S. attorney, as close to airtight as a public corruption case gets in this district. The indictment was unsealed on a Tuesday morning in February 2024. Federal agents had coordinated with the Hinds County Board of Supervisors and with senior leadership inside the sheriff's office to ensure that Chrysler would not be at the jail, would not be armed, and would not be surrounded by deputies loyal to him when the arrest took place. The meeting was set under a different pretext: a logistics review at the U.S. Attorney's office on East Capitol Street, an address Chrysler had visited dozens of times in his official capacity. He drove himself there. He parked in the visitor lot. He took the elevator up to the 4th floor. 2 FBI agents and an assistant U.S. attorney were waiting in the conference room. What followed, captured on the body-worn cameras of the federal agents conducting the arrest, was a confrontation that lasted less than 4 minutes from the moment the door closed behind him to the moment the handcuffs were applied. Lead Agent: Yeah. Sheriff Crisler, please have a seat. Chrysler: What's going on? Lead Agent: Sheriff, we have a federal indictment for your arrest. The charges are soliciting and accepting bribes as a public official and providing ammunition to a known convicted felon. We need you to stand up and place your hands on the table. Chrysler: Wait, hold on. There's been a mistake. Who signed off on this? Lead Agent: The U.S. Attorney's Office, Sheriff. The grand jury returned the indictment yesterday. Chrysler: I want my lawyer right now. Lead Agent: You'll have that opportunity, Sheriff. Right now, I need you to stand up and place your hands behind your back. He did. He stood up slowly. His shoulders dropped. The career law enforcement officer in him understood, in a way that no civilian could, exactly what was happening and exactly how the next 48 hours would unfold. He was photographed. He was fingerprinted. He was processed into the federal holding facility he had visited many times, but never from the inside. By the end of the day, his mugshot was on every local news station in Mississippi. He did not speak to investigators. He did not give a statement. He invoked his right to counsel and stayed silent. Those were the last words he spoke as a free man for the better part of the next 2 years. The Hinds County Board of Supervisors voted to suspend Chrysler from his duties as sheriff the morning the indictment was unsealed. Within a week, the appointment was formally vacated and an interim sheriff was named to serve out what remained of the term. The locks on the sheriff's office in Raymond were changed. His department-issued vehicle, weapon, badge, and credentials were collected. The photograph of him in dress uniform that had hung in the lobby of the sheriff's office headquarters was removed the same week. There was no ceremony. There was no announcement. The photograph simply was not there one morning when deputies came in for shift change. The trial was set for November 6, 2024, in the federal courthouse on East Capitol Street in downtown Jackson, a 3-block walk from the U.S. Attorney's office, where Chrysler had been arrested 9 months earlier. The presiding judge was a longtime federal jurist with a reputation for tight courtrooms, short patience for theatrics, and a particular intolerance for public officials who use their offices for personal enrichment. The lead prosecutor was an assistant U.S. attorney with more than a decade of public corruption experience, working under United States Attorney Todd W. Chrysler's defense team mounted what observers described as a credibility attack strategy. They did not seriously contest that the cash had changed hands. The recordings were too clean. The marked currency was too well documented. Instead, they attacked individual A, his prior convictions, his cooperation deal, his motivation to fabricate or exaggerate to reduce his own federal exposure. They argued that the recordings, in context, did not establish the necessary intent. They argued that the tier transfer was a routine administrative decision. They argued that the ammunition transfer had been a misunderstanding. They argued ultimately that the federal government had taken an inappropriate conversation between two men who had grown up in the same neighborhood and reframed it as a federal corruption case. The jury was not persuaded. Trial testimony spanned 3 days. The government called 14 witnesses, including the booking sergeant from the Hinds County Jail, the civilian HR employee from the Sheriff's Office Hiring Division, the FBI case agent who had run Individual A as a cooperator, a forensic accountant from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, and Individual A himself, who took the stand under a cooperation agreement and walked the jury through each of the 3 cash handoffs in detail. The defense called 3 witnesses and rested without putting Chrysler on the stand. Closing arguments were delivered on the morning of November 8, 2024. The jury began deliberations just before noon. They returned a verdict at approximately 2 o'clock that afternoon. 2 hours. Guilty. Both counts. A federal corruption jury in Mississippi, looking at the entire body of evidence the government had spent more than 3 years assembling, needed roughly the length of an extended lunch break to convict the recently sitting sheriff of the state's largest county. Chrysler did not visibly react when the verdict was read. He sat. He listened. He nodded once when the judge addressed him directly about the upcoming sentencing date. He was released on the same conditions of pretrial supervision that had been in place since his arrest, with an enhanced reporting requirement and a surrender date set in advance of sentencing. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for February 6, 2025. In the statement issued by the U.S. Attorney's Office the afternoon of the verdict, United States Attorney Todd W. said, in part, "This conviction should serve as notice to public officials in Mississippi who sell their office in exchange for bribes that the Department of Justice will work to hold them accountable. The citizens of Hinds County and the men and women of the Sheriff's Office who serve them with integrity deserve nothing less." The maximum penalty Chrysler faced was 10 years in federal prison and a $250,000 fine on each of the 2 counts, a theoretical exposure of 20 years and $500,000 in fines. The actual sentence would fall within the federal sentencing guidelines, factoring in his lack of prior criminal history, his decades of public service, the dollar amount involved, and the abuse of trust enhancements that federal prosecutors had already indicated they would seek. What the sentence could not undo was the broader pattern the Chrysler conviction had revealed. Within 12 months of his November 2024 verdict, federal authorities would announce a separate indictment of 20 individuals, including 14 current and former Mississippi Delta law enforcement officers and 2 sitting Mississippi sheriffs, for accepting bribes from undercover FBI agents posing as cartel drug couriers. The bribes in that case ran as high as $37,000. The pattern was the same. The U.S. attorney handling those cases would describe it in a public statement as a monumental betrayal of public trust. The FBI Jackson special agent in charge would put it more plainly. Law enforcement, he said, is only effective when the community they protect can trust the officers are honestly serving the community's interests. Marshand Crisler had served 20 years in the Jackson Police Department. He had served 4 years on the Jackson City Council. He had taken the oath of office as Sheriff of Hinds County on a clear Wednesday morning in August 2021, with his wife holding the Bible and his daughter recording the moment from the second row. He had been sworn to uphold the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the state of Mississippi, and the laws of Hinds County. He had broken that oath within 90 days. When Mississippi historians eventually write the full account of the corruption wave that swept through Delta law enforcement in the early 2020s, the Chrysler conviction will be where the timeline begins. 2 hours of jury deliberation, $9,500 in cash, 1 box of ammunition, 1 career, 1 badge, 1 oath, all of it gone. This case was disturbing, but the case on the right-hand side of your screen right now goes even deeper into the rotten heart of small-town corruption. Click it before you leave.